How can a man who once walked beside divine glory end his days beneath a sword, condemned by an earthly king's fear? Peace be with you, dear friends, wherever you find yourself tonight, perhaps by candlelight, perhaps in quiet rest. Welcome to St. Lives. Subscribe and journey with us through faith and time. This is the story of St. James the Greater, the passionate fisherman called by Christ, transformed by divine love, and martyred beneath Herod's rule. His fiery heart purified through suffering, his legacy carried beyond death, across sea and centuries, toward eternal pilgrimage. The morning light over Galilee was pale and gentle, the kind that moves slowly across the rippling surface of the lake before it reaches the hills. Fishermen's voices rose and fell like a chant as they pulled their nets to shore, the smell of salt and tar in the air. Among them was James, son of Zebedee, strong and broad-shouldered, his hands rough from labor and sun. He worked beside his younger brother John, their father watching with quiet pride from the small wooden boat. It was a life that seemed destined never to change, steady, simple, tied to the water and the wind. Yet even as he worked, something stirred in James's heart, a restlessness he could not name. He often lifted his eyes from the nets to the horizon, as if searching for a sign, unaware that destiny was already walking toward him along the shore. Then came the day that changed everything. A voice called out above the hum of the waves, a voice unlike any other, calm yet commanding. "Follow me." Those two words carried the weight of eternity, and in them James heard something irresistible. He looked at John, then at his father, who said nothing but seemed to understand that a greater calling had arrived. Leaving the nets behind, they followed the man from Nazareth, their footsteps soft in the sand. There was no promise of comfort, no explanation, only the certainty of a presence that made all else fade. From that moment, the Sea of Galilee, which had once been their world, became only a memory of beginnings. As they traveled with the Master, James's fiery spirit revealed itself. He was quick to speak, quicker to act, full of courage but not yet tempered by grace. Alongside his brother, he formed part of the small circle that would one day be called the Sons of Thunder, a name given not in rebuke, but in recognition of their zeal, their loud hearts eager for divine justice. There was power in his passion, yet also danger, for unbridled fire can burn as easily as it warms. Jesus saw in James not only the strength of the fisherman, but the depth of a soul that could one day be refined into holiness. Through every dusty road, every evening fire shared among the 12, James learned what it meant to listen, not only to his Lord's words, but to the stillness between them. The nights were filled with silence and stars. Sometimes James would lie awake, staring at the heavens reflected in the water, and wonder what kind of kingdom this Jesus spoke of, one not built with stone or swords, but upon love and sacrifice. He could not yet grasp it fully. For now it was enough to walk beside him, to witness miracles, to feel that the impossible was no longer distant. And yet, beneath the wonder, he carried an impatience common to the young and the passionate, a desire for glory, for triumph, for heaven brought swiftly to earth. The gentle rebukes of Christ were the first touches of mercy shaping his thunder into peace. As their journey deepened, James began to see that holiness does not erase human fire. It purifies it. His loyalty to Christ grew fierce, his heart open but unpolished, his faith like iron newly forged. Each encounter, each parable, each healing by the roadside was a lesson in love's quiet endurance. And though he could not know it, every step along that Galilean shore led him toward a crown not of victory, but of martyrdom. In those early days, when laughter still mingled with learning and the weight of the cross had not yet shadowed their hearts, James's story began not in greatness, but in a simple yes. A fisherman became a follower. A man of storms began to walk toward still waters. It is a mystery that echoes through every believer's life, that the first act of faith is not understanding, but surrender. And so the tale of St. James begins as every journey of grace begins, not in power or prophecy, but in the quiet courage to leave behind what is known for what is eternal. The nets were left upon the shore, but the call that drew him from them would ripple through centuries, across oceans, and into the hearts of pilgrims yet unborn. For faith, like the sea, never truly ends. It only deepens. The journey that began on the shores of Galilee soon unfolded into a life of wonder and mystery. And yet, as James followed the Lord across the towns and valleys of Judea, his heart remained both bold and unrefined. The man who had once known only the rhythm of wind and wave now walked among the murmurs of crowds, the fragrance of olive trees, and the voices of those hungry for healing. It was in these days that James began to learn what discipleship truly meant. He saw the poor lifted, the blind made to see, the sick restored, and each miracle struck deeper into his understanding of who this teacher truly was. But even as faith grew in him, so did questions, for he was a man who lived not only by sight, but by feeling. The fire in him still burned fiercely, a reminder that holiness must often be tempered through humility. Jesus chose James, with Peter and John, to stand apart from the rest, to witness not only his public works, but his most private moments of glory and sorrow. Among all the 12, it was these 3 who were closest to the heart of the Lord. They saw what others could not, and this intimacy shaped James in ways he could not have foreseen. One day, they followed Jesus into the home of Jairus, whose daughter had died. The house was heavy with grief, filled with the sound of mourners' cries. Yet Jesus turned to them and said softly, "Do not weep. The child is not dead but sleeping." Then, with a touch and a word, life returned to her. James stood frozen, unable to speak, the miracle entering not just his eyes but his soul. Death itself had bent before this man. The thought filled him with awe and fear, and a trembling reverence he could not yet name. He began to sense that to walk beside such power was not only privilege, but preparation. For light, when revealed so fully, often casts deep shadows of trial. In time, the moment came when Jesus led them up a high mountain apart from the others. The air was thin, the climb long, and the stillness strange. Then suddenly, before their eyes, his face shone like the sun, and his garments became dazzling white. Moses and Elijah appeared beside him, and the heavens seemed to open. James fell to his knees, unable to bear the brilliance. Peter stammered something about building tents, but no one moved. From the cloud came a voice, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Those words seemed to pierce the very earth beneath them. In that instant, James glimpsed the divine glory that the prophets had long awaited, a revelation that filled him with both rapture and dread. When it was over, and only Jesus stood before them again, his face calm and human once more, the world seemed smaller somehow, quieter, as if nothing could ever again be entirely ordinary. That vision remained with James like a hidden flame, warming him in dark hours, though at times he misunderstood its meaning. He dreamed of a kingdom radiant and victorious, of glory descending upon Jerusalem. He imagined places of honor at his master's side. When he and his brother John later asked to sit at his right and left in glory, their request came not from arrogance, but from the earnest, untamed love of men who still believed that holiness might resemble triumph. Jesus answered with patient sorrow, saying, "You do not know what you ask. Can you drink the cup that I drink?" And they said, "We can." Perhaps they did not yet understand that the cup was one of suffering, the crown one of thorns. But James, in his zeal, believed himself ready. The Lord's gaze rested on him, a look filled not with rebuke, but with foreknowledge, the gentle sorrow of one who sees the road ahead. "You will indeed drink my cup," he said quietly. As the months passed, the ministry grew more dangerous. The authorities watched, uneasy with the man who spoke with authority, yet wielded no sword. Crowds followed, the sick pressed close, and the disciples felt both joy and fear in equal measure. James stood often beside Peter, learning the strength of obedience and the cost of love. When Jesus sent them forth 2 by 2, James went eagerly, proclaiming the kingdom, healing the afflicted, driving out spirits in his name. For the first time, he felt the power of faith working through him, not his own strength, but a grace that flowed like light through open hands. Yet even then, he sensed that this mission was only the beginning of something far greater, something that would ask not just his voice, but his life. There were nights when they camped under the stars, and James would look at the flickering firelight on the faces of his companions, Peter thoughtful, John serene, Matthew quiet and observant. And he would feel a strange peace settle over him. The man who once dreamed of storms and conquest was beginning to understand that true power is born of surrender. Still, the thunder within him was not gone. There were moments when impatience flared, when he struggled to accept the slowness of God's plan. Yet Christ never withdrew his love. He let James wrestle with his heart, shaping him through nearness, as iron sharpens iron. One evening, as they journeyed through Samaria, the townspeople refused them lodging because they were heading toward Jerusalem. James's old fire rose again. "Lord," he said, "shall we call down fire from heaven to consume them?" The memory of Elijah's fiery judgment lingered in his mind. But Jesus turned, eyes full of sorrow, and said, "You do not know what spirit you are of. The Son of Man came not to destroy lives, but to save them." The rebuke was gentle but unforgettable. It was a turning point for James, the beginning of his transformation from man of wrath to man of mercy. That night, as they walked on in silence, the air cool around them, he felt something inside him shift. His heart, once proud in its zeal, began to learn the humility of compassion. In this time, James grew closer to Mary, the mother of Jesus, who moved quietly among them, her presence like balm. From her he learned patience, gentleness, the strength of silent faith. He saw in her eyes the reflection of her son's peace, and something within him softened. Her prayerfulness steadied his soul when his own courage faltered. In her, he saw the heart of discipleship, a heart that holds joy and sorrow in the same embrace. And so, the years of following unfolded, like waves upon the shore, each one shaping James more deeply. He was still the son of thunder, but the storm had begun to serve the light. What once was pride now became passion for truth. What once was impatience became longing for holiness. In every trial, he saw a lesson in love, and though he could not yet see the cross waiting beyond the horizon, he walked toward it with open eyes. As the night deepened and the stars reflected upon the water, he might have remembered that first call by the lake. The nets abandoned, the world left behind. He could not know that one day others would leave their lives behind to follow the path marked by his name. For now there was only the sound of waves, the whisper of prayer, and the quiet certainty that he had chosen well. And perhaps even then, heaven was already whispering that this fiery fisherman, this son of thunder, would one day be the first to die for the love of the Master he so fiercely adored. The years passed as quietly as they were filled with meaning. The days of Christ's public ministry deepened into something more intimate, more solemn. The disciples had grown accustomed to the rhythm of their mission: crowds in the morning, teachings by the lakeside, healings in the afternoon, and the hushed prayers of their Master long after night had fallen. Yet something within the Lord's manner began to change. The tone of his voice carried more gravity. His words seemed to point toward an unseen sorrow ahead. James felt it most keenly in those final journeys toward Jerusalem. Though his heart still burned with the desire for the coming of God's kingdom, a shadow of foreboding had begun to flicker through his faith. The laughter that had once come easily among the 12 now felt more precious, more fragile, as though each shared meal was a farewell in disguise. One evening, when the sun sank behind the Mount of Olives, Jesus gathered the 3 who were closest to him, Peter, James, and John, and led them up the slopes of a quiet garden. The olive trees stood ancient and gnarled, their silver leaves catching the moonlight like drops of water. The Lord's voice was low, almost trembling. "Remain here," he said, "and watch with me." James watched him walk a little farther and fall upon his face in prayer. Never had he seen such anguish in his Master, whose every breath seemed a struggle between the will of heaven and the weight of the world. The night air was still, the distant city sleeping, and yet all of creation seemed to wait for his answer. James tried to stay awake, to keep vigil, but his body, weary from the long day, betrayed him. The heaviness of sorrow, more than fatigue, pressed upon him until his eyes closed against his will. When he awoke, the Lord's face was calm again, marked by quiet resolve, and soldiers' torches already glimmered through the trees. The arrest came swiftly, like a nightmare too real to grasp. In the confusion, James drew back, helpless, watching as Judas approached with that fateful kiss. The clash of steel, the cries, the flight of the disciples. These things passed in a blur of fear and disbelief. For the first time since the call by the sea, James felt utterly lost. How could the one who stilled storms be bound by ropes? How could the one who raised the dead be led away like a prisoner? The hours that followed were filled with silence and confusion. He did not see the scourging or the trial, but he heard the rumors, and his heart broke with every word. On the morning of the crucifixion, the streets of Jerusalem were heavy with dust and sorrow. James, though afraid, followed at a distance. He saw the crowd gathered at Golgotha, the jeers of the soldiers, the cross raised against the sky. The thunder in his soul fell quiet, replaced by an emptiness he could not describe. His brother John stood close to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and James remained a few paces behind, unable to draw nearer, his courage fractured by grief. He had seen Jesus radiant on the mountaintop. Now he saw him broken upon wood. The contradiction tore through him like a blade. He could not understand how glory and agony could dwell in the same person, how the light of Tabor could coexist with the darkness of Calvary. For hours the sky dimmed until the earth itself seemed to tremble. The words of Jesus reached him faintly, words of forgiveness, of mercy, of surrender. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Then, a silence deeper than death. James felt the weight of it press against his chest. He turned away, not in rejection, but in sorrow too vast for words. The fisherman who had once walked upon the bright shores of Galilee now stood on the edge of despair, his faith like a net torn open by the storm. In the days that followed, Jerusalem was cloaked in mourning. The disciples hid behind closed doors, whispering prayers they barely believed. James sat in darkness, haunted by memory, the laughter by the fire, the warmth of his hand upon his shoulder, the echo of the words, "Follow me." He had followed, yes, but to what end? Everything seemed lost, unfinished. Yet even in that desolation, some ember of faith remained alive within him, faint but unquenchable. Perhaps this was what love meant, to believe even when every reason to believe was gone. Then came the dawn that changed everything. The women brought word that the tomb was empty, that angels had spoken, that he was risen. At first, James could not comprehend it. Hope, long buried, stirred within him like the first light of morning breaking through a storm. When at last the Lord appeared among them, saying, "Peace be with you," the world seemed to breathe again. The joy that flooded the room wasn't loud or wild. It was quiet, holy, the joy of hearts remade. James fell to his knees, tears filling his eyes, unable to speak. In that moment, all his failures were forgiven, all his fears dissolved. The resurrection was not only Christ's triumph, it was the rebirth of every heart that had ever loved him. In the weeks that followed, James saw the world with new eyes. The risen Lord moved among them, speaking softly of forgiveness, of the Spirit that was soon to come. He spoke of a mission without boundaries, of a kingdom that would reach every corner of the earth. James listened, and something within him awakened, the sense that his restless heart had at last found its purpose. He was no longer merely the son of thunder, but a man called to carry peace into a world that would not easily accept it. The ascension was the final wonder. They climbed again to the Mount of Olives, as they had on the night of sorrow. But this time the air was filled not with dread, but with light. Jesus raised his hands in blessing, and as he spoke, he was lifted before their eyes, vanishing into the brilliance of the clouds. James stood in silence, the wind moving gently around him, and for once he did not reach for understanding. He simply believed. For faith, he now knew, was not the grasping of the mind, but the surrender of the heart. In the days that followed, they waited in prayer, gathered with Mary, the mother of Jesus, in that small upper room that would soon be shaken by heaven's breath. The world beyond their door was hostile, yet they remained steadfast. The days of fear were not yet over, but hope had taken root too deeply to be uprooted again. James often gazed at Mary, her calm face radiant in candlelight, and thought of how she had endured both cross and glory without faltering. He saw in her the mirror of what faith could be, a heart that trusted even when sight was lost. Then came the sound, the wind, the fire, the Spirit descending like tongues of light upon them. The house was filled with glory, their souls ablaze not with earthly zeal but with divine courage. James felt the Spirit surge within him like the tide returning to the sea, washing away the last shadows of fear. From that hour, he knew he was ready, not for triumph, but for witness, not for power, but for the cross that waited still unseen. As night fell and the stars returned over Jerusalem, James stood on the rooftop and looked out over the sleeping city. He could hear distant songs from the temple, the faint hum of life continuing as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. The Lord had risen, and death was no longer master. The world that once seemed vast now felt like a single path stretching toward eternity. In his heart, the old thunder stirred once more. But it was no longer the voice of impatience. It was the heartbeat of faith. And so the second chapter of his life began. The mission of one who had seen the glory of God and the depths of man's sorrow, and who would soon give his own blood to bear witness that love is stronger than death. The days after Pentecost were alive with a power no one could have imagined. The apostles, once timid and uncertain, now spoke with voices that shook the hearts of those who heard them. The wind of the Spirit had done what no sword could do. It had turned fear into fire. James, whose spirit had once burned too fiercely with human passion, now felt that same flame purified, its light clear and steady. No longer a man of impulse, he had become a man of courage born from grace. His words no longer sought to conquer, but to console. The Son of Thunder had learned to echo the heart of Christ. Jerusalem, however, was a city divided between wonder and unrest. Some believed with joy, while others plotted with anger. The rulers of the temple saw the apostles as a growing danger, and their teaching as an infection spreading among the people. Yet James and the others preached openly in the streets, their confidence flowing not from defiance, but from conviction. When he spoke, James did not argue or persuade with skill. His faith itself was the argument. Those who heard him could sense that he had walked beside the Master, that he had seen the eyes of God in the eyes of a man. The church began to take root. The believers gathered in small rooms, breaking bread and sharing prayer. The memory of the Lord's words was their nourishment, the promise of his return their strength. James found himself drawn to the Eucharist more deeply with each passing day. In the breaking of the bread, he felt once again that night in the upper room, when the world had held its breath and Christ had given himself in silence. The mystery of that gift became his life's compass: to serve, to teach, to suffer. These were no longer burdens, but offerings poured out before God. Yet, as the light grew in the church, the shadows lengthened around it. The same city that had crucified the Lord could not long endure those who bore his spirit. James watched as persecution began. Peter and John were imprisoned, Stephen was stoned, and the streets of Jerusalem trembled with fear. Yet the apostles did not hide. They spoke with greater boldness, knowing that the cross would follow them wherever they went. When Stephen fell beneath the stones, his face shining like an angel's, James wept, not with despair, but with awe. He saw in that young martyr's death the fulfillment of what Christ had promised. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. From that moment, he no longer feared suffering. He understood that the cup his master had spoken of was not a curse, but a grace. To share in the Lord's pain was to share in his victory. As the years passed, James became a pillar among the disciples. His authority was quiet but firm, his presence one of strength and peace. He worked among the people tirelessly, visiting the sick, blessing children, comforting widows. His fiery nature had become a steady flame that warmed all who came near. Yet beneath the calm, there was an unspoken certainty in his soul that his own path would not end in comfort. The prophecy of the Lord still lingered. You will indeed drink my cup. Sometimes, late at night, as he prayed in the stillness of the upper room, he would think of those words and feel a strange peace settle over him. For in the end, what greater gift could a disciple receive than to follow the Master even unto death? It was during one such quiet evening that word came of unrest spreading through the city. King Herod Agrippa, eager to please both Rome and the temple authorities, had begun a new campaign to suppress the followers of Christ. The memory of Peter's escape from prison had humiliated the rulers, and now they sought a swift example, someone whose death would strike fear into the hearts of believers. James, known for his courage, was chosen. The soldiers came without warning, bursting into the place of prayer. The disciples scattered, their cries echoing in the narrow alleys, but James did not run. He rose calmly, his hands open, and said only, "The Lord's will be done." The guards bound him and led him through the darkened streets, their torches casting trembling light upon the walls. In the cell where they placed him, there was little but stone and shadow. Yet to James, it wasn't a place of despair. He prayed through the night, his heart lifted beyond the prison's walls. The silence was broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the faint murmur of a soldier outside. That soldier, hardened by countless arrests, found himself strangely moved. The peace on the prisoner's face unsettled him. How could a man awaiting death look so free? As dawn neared, he entered the cell, driven by curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked. James looked at him gently and said, "A servant of the living God, who died and rose again for you." The man scoffed at first, but as the hours passed, he could not shake the quiet radiance of those words. By morning, the soldier knelt beside James, asking to be baptized. Using a small basin of water from the cell, the apostle traced the sign of the cross upon his brow, whispering the same words once spoken over him, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." When the guards returned, both prisoner and soldier stood together. Herod's men were bewildered by what they saw. Two men, one condemned and one free, united by an unseen strength. They led James through the streets to the place of judgment. The crowds gathered quickly, some mocking, others silent. Herod Agrippa, seated in his court, looked upon the apostle with contempt disguised as ceremony. "You have defied the law of the king and stirred rebellion among the people," he declared. James answered only, "I have obeyed the law of God." There was no anger in his tone, no plea for mercy, only serenity. The king, fearing the murmurs of the priests, gave the order without hesitation. The sentence was death by the sword. As they led him away, the newly baptized soldier followed close behind, declaring his faith openly. When Herod's guards tried to silence him, he refused, saying, "I will die with him, for his God is now my God." The two were brought to the place of execution outside the city walls. The morning sun rose over Jerusalem, gilding the stones with light. James knelt and prayed, his lips moving softly in gratitude rather than fear. The soldier knelt beside him. James turned to him and whispered, "Peace be with you, brother. Today we shall see the king." The executioner hesitated for a moment, his hand trembling. But duty prevailed. The blade fell once, twice, and the air grew still. There was no cry, no struggle, only silence, the kind of silence that feels like prayer. Herod's soldiers withdrew, and the crowd dispersed. But among the believers who watched from afar, something unshakable took root. James had been the first of the 12 to give his life, and in that sacrifice, the church found new courage. His blood became a seed, his death a beginning. The Son of Thunder had spoken his last word, not through wrath, but through witness. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned to gold, the faithful gathered secretly to recover his body. They carried it away under the cover of night, weeping not for loss, but for love. The air was still, and the stars hung like lamps above the hills. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of the sea might have reached his resting place. For the man who had once left his nets beside Galilee had at last cast his soul into the boundless ocean of God's mercy. His journey, though ended in time, had only just begun in eternity. The city of Jerusalem had grown still after the execution, as if the wind itself hesitated to pass through its streets. Yet within the hearts of the faithful, a different kind of movement began, a quiet stirring that no earthly power could suppress. Those who had known James remembered the calm on his face, the way he had accepted death without resistance, and they whispered his name in their prayers as though invoking a strength they did not yet possess. He had been the first of the apostles to fall, and though his death filled them with sorrow, it also gave them a strange peace. They knew now that the road they walked wasn't one of victory in this world, but of witness, and that the blood of their brother had sealed the truth they lived for. Among those who mourned was Peter, who had once been imprisoned by the same Herod, but miraculously freed by an angel. When he heard of James's beheading, he wept as one who had lost both a friend and a mirror of his own destiny. They had begun together on the shores of Galilee, rough men shaped by salt and wind, and now the sea between life and death had taken one and waited for the other. The body of the apostle, so precious to those who loved him, could not remain in the hands of his enemies. According to the tradition whispered through the centuries, his followers came by night to claim him. They moved through the narrow alleys like shadows, guided by faith rather than sight. The guards had already turned their attention elsewhere, their duty fulfilled, their conscience dulled by obedience. Under the pale moonlight, the small band of disciples wrapped his body in linen, as they had seen done for their master years before, and carried him away in silence. It was said that when they lifted him, the air grew still and fragrant, as though heaven itself leaned closer. Some claimed that even the stars above them flickered with unusual brilliance that night, a quiet sign for those who believed that death was never the end. The story that follows is one of both history and mystery. How his body came to rest far beyond the lands of Judea has been told in many ways, each version wrapped in wonder, yet all speaking the same truth, that divine providence can lead where human strength cannot. It is said that after the burial, a group of his disciples, inspired by a dream, or perhaps by divine instruction, placed his body upon a small boat at the port of Jaffa. The vessel had no oars, no sail, no pilot. They entrusted it to the sea, praying that the God who commands wind and wave would guide it to its appointed shore. For 7 days and 7 nights the boat drifted westward, carried not by current, but by grace. The sea was calm, the skies untroubled, and the followers who watched from the cliffs saw it disappear into the horizon with tears in their eyes, unsure whether they were witnessing an ending or the beginning of something eternal. According to the ancient traditions preserved by the faithful in the far lands of Hispania, that same vessel came to rest on the coast of Galicia, in a quiet cove where the river met the ocean. The people who dwelt there were pagans, worshippers of stone idols, and they were astonished when they saw a boat drift ashore without a crew, bearing within it the body of a man whose face seemed untouched by decay. The linen cloths were bright as new snow, and a fragrance like incense filled the air. Some fell to their knees in fear, while others fled, thinking the sea had given up one of its gods. But among them was a woman of gentler heart, who, seeing the calm upon the stranger's features, declared that this must be one of the holy men from the land where the sun rises, a messenger of the true God. Word spread quickly through the villages, and soon the local queen, a woman named Lupa, heard of the marvel and sent her servants to investigate. The tale that unfolded is one of divine reversal, of pride turned to faith. Queen Lupa, like Herod before her, resisted at first. She mocked the strangers who came to ask for a burial place for the apostle, accusing them of deceit. To rid herself of them, she directed them to her castle on Mount Ilicino, saying they might take the oxen from her stable to draw the body's cart. What she did not tell them was that these oxen were wild bulls, fierce and untamed, meant to destroy them. But when the disciples approached, the beasts grew gentle, lowering their heads as though in reverence. Lupa, witnessing this from afar, trembled with fear. The disciples harnessed the oxen, and they carried the saint's body smoothly to the place chosen by heaven. Realizing her folly, the queen fell to her knees, renouncing her idols and asking for baptism. From that day, she became a protector of the sacred relic. The tomb was prepared in a hidden grove, and there, beneath the shelter of trees and stars, they laid St. James to rest. Centuries would pass before the secret of that resting place was revealed again. The Roman world fell, kingdoms rose and vanished, and yet the earth guarded its treasure in silence. Then, in the early 9th century, a hermit named Pelayo, who lived in prayer among the Galician hills, began to see strange lights in the night sky, a cluster of stars that seemed to fall upon the same field again and again. Curious, he told the local bishop, Theodomir of Iria Flavia, who followed him to the spot. There, beneath the field of light, they uncovered a stone tomb bearing the inscription of Jacobus, the name of the apostle. The news spread swiftly, and pilgrims from every corner of Christendom began to journey toward that sacred place, which they called Campus Stellae, the Field of Stars, Compostela. Thus began one of the greatest pilgrimages in Christian history. Kings and peasants alike walked the long roads toward Santiago, seeking forgiveness, healing, and grace. For every soul that traveled those paths, St. James became not only an intercessor in heaven, but a companion on the road, a friend of travelers, a symbol of faith that endures across distance and time. His image, the pilgrim with the scallop shell, became a sign of hope for weary hearts. The man who had once been the son of thunder now walked beside millions in silence, his voice heard in the sound of footsteps on the ancient stones. And in the quiet of the cathedral that rose above his shrine, the story of his life was told again and again, not in thunder, but in whispers, in prayers said by candlelight. There, beneath the great archways, one could almost feel the pulse of his faith still beating, like the echo of waves against Galilee's shore. For James, who had followed Christ to the very end, had found in death not defeat, but return, to the sea of souls, to the eternal call that began with a voice saying, "Follow me." It is said that those who walk the road to Santiago carry within them the same longing that once stirred in the fisherman's heart, the longing for a home beyond the horizon, for a peace that does not end. Each step taken toward Compostela is a quiet echo of that ancient journey across the sea, when a boat without oars carried the apostle to a foreign land, proving that the Spirit's wind needs no human hand to steer it. And in that mystery lies the enduring truth of his story, that those who give their lives for love never truly vanish. They are carried, as James was, by currents unseen, borne ever onward by grace, until they rest at last in the harbor of God. Through the centuries that followed, the memory of St. James the Greater spread like a current flowing from the heart of the Church into every shore it touched. His name, once whispered in fear among the persecuted believers of Jerusalem, became a song upon the lips of countless pilgrims. From the hills of France to the forests of Germany, from the coasts of Portugal to the plains of Castile, men and women walked westward toward the land where he rested. The road to Compostela became more than a path. It became a mirror of the soul's own pilgrimage, a slow shedding of burdens, a silent dialogue between heaven and earth. Along the way, chapels rose, stones bore crosses carved by weary hands, and villages flourished wherever travelers paused to pray or share bread. The rhythm of feet on the road became the heartbeat of Europe's faith. In every age, though wars came and empires fell, the pilgrim's road endured, as if guarded by the unseen presence of the apostle who had walked beside Christ and still walked beside all who sought him. Yet the story of St. James did not end with the building of shrines or the gathering of pilgrims. His legacy took root in the heart of nations, shaping the very spirit of a people. Spain, the land that received his body from the sea, came to see him not only as protector, but as brother, a patron saint who understood the toil of farmers, the courage of soldiers, the humility of monks. In the darkest hours of invasion and fear, the cry, Santiago, would rise from battlefields like a prayer and a promise. The stories told of his apparition as a warrior saint, riding white into the fray to defend the faithful, may not have belonged to history in the ordinary sense, yet they carried truth in another way. The truth that faith, when lived deeply, awakens courage in those who believe they fight for something eternal. James had once learned to lay down his sword for love. Now his spirit lent strength to a nation struggling to preserve the light of faith through centuries of trial. In monasteries along the pilgrimage roads, monks copied scripture by candlelight and offered shelter to travelers. They saw each pilgrim as a reflection of Christ himself, hungry, weary, and worthy of care. The rule of St. Benedict echoed through the cloisters, but the spirit of St. James walked their halls. He was not a distant figure of history, but a living presence, one who reminded them that holiness was found not in the comfort of walls, but in the journey of the heart. Pilgrims would kneel before his image, tracing the scallop shell upon their cloaks, and whisper their prayers into the stillness. Some came seeking healing. Others came seeking forgiveness. Many came without knowing why, drawn by a longing they could not name. And when they reached the cathedral at Santiago, when the first notes of the organ filled the vast nave and the incense curled upward toward the vaulted ceiling, they felt as if the journey within them had found its end. But faith, as James had learned, never truly ends. It only transforms. The same Spirit that carried him from Galilee to Jerusalem, from death to eternity, continued to move through those who invoked his name. Across the centuries, poets wrote of him as the pilgrim's star, the guide of those who travel in darkness. Artists painted him with staff and shell, his gaze both stern and compassionate. He became, in the collective soul of the faithful, a symbol of perseverance, a reminder that every step taken toward God, however small, is a victory over despair. Even in times when the world grew weary and faith seemed distant, the figure of St. James remained a beacon, his story a bridge between earth and heaven. Legends grew around the road to Compostela, stories of miracles and conversions, of sinners who found peace and skeptics who found belief. Some spoke of angels walking unseen among the pilgrims, others of stars guiding them when they lost their way. But beneath every tale was a deeper truth. That pilgrimage is not only a journey through land, but through the self. To walk the Camino was to walk the same inner road that James had walked, from ambition to surrender, from pride to grace. The dust of the road became a sacrament, each footstep a prayer. Pilgrims carried with them their fears, their grief, their hopes, and along the long miles these burdens became lighter, as though the saint himself took them one by one and placed them at the foot of the cross he had once stood beneath. In the quiet hours of the night, when the pilgrims rested in the ancient hostels beneath flickering lamps, the stories of St. James would be told again. They spoke of his youth, his impetuous zeal, his closeness to the Lord, and his martyrdom beneath the sword of Herod. The listeners would fall silent at the telling of his final words, words that spoke not of anger or defiance, but of forgiveness and faith. For in that surrender lay his true power. The Son of Thunder had become the apostle of peace, and through his death he had given the Church its first witness among the 12, that love is stronger than fear. His example reminded them that holiness is not perfection, but transformation, the slow turning of the heart toward God, until even suffering becomes a song of praise. There were those who questioned the stories, who said that such legends were no more than pious dreams. But faith has never depended on proof. The tomb at Compostela, whether seen by angels or by men, stood as a sign of something larger than the sum of its miracles. It was a symbol of fidelity, a testament that one man's yes to God could echo through centuries and reshape the world. The countless pilgrims who knelt before that tomb did not seek history. They sought hope. They found in James not a distant hero, but a companion who knew the weariness of the road, the sting of loss, and the peace that comes only through surrender. Even now, when the modern world moves faster than thought, the pilgrimage continues. The roads remain worn by the souls of those who seek meaning beyond measure, those who wish to remember that life itself is a journey toward the divine. The scallop shell still marks the way, the stars still shine over Compostela, and in the hush of dawn, one can almost hear the same question that once stirred the fisherman's heart. Will you follow me? And as before, the only true answer is not a word, but a step, the step of faith taken into the unknown. The story of St. James is thus the story of all who walk toward God. It begins with a call and ends with a homecoming. It moves through storms, through silence, through the moments when the path seems lost, yet somehow always leads back to light. For the man who once left his nets beside the Sea of Galilee never stopped traveling. His journey continues in every soul that dares to believe that love can conquer death, and so his legacy endures, not as thunder, but as a quiet tide that rises and falls through time, drawing all hearts toward the eternal shore where the voice of Christ still whispers, as it did long ago, "Follow me, and you will find rest." The centuries rolled onward, yet the story of St. James remained alive, flowing quietly through the veins of history like a hidden stream that never dries. His name, once uttered in trembling by the early church, became a steady rhythm in the prayers of nations. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela grew not only in numbers, but in meaning. It was no longer just a physical journey across mountains and plains. It became a symbol of the human soul's slow ascent toward the divine, a walk of repentance and rebirth. Kings and commoners, scholars and sinners, each one took to the road carrying the same humble hope, to find God along the way, to be changed by the walking itself. The roads leading to his shrine branched across Europe like veins of faith. The French way, the Northern way, the Silver Route, all converging at that sacred field of stars. Each path had its chapels, its legends, its echoes of prayer carried by the wind. Travelers often said that along the Camino, time itself seemed to slow, as though heaven leaned closer to earth. In these centuries of pilgrimage, St. James became more than a figure of memory. He became a living companion to every wanderer who set foot on the dusty road. The faithful spoke of his unseen presence, how he walked beside those who lost heart, how he guided the lame and comforted the lonely. In the silence of dawn, when only the sound of footsteps and birds filled the air, pilgrims often felt that the apostle himself kept pace beside them. His image adorned the milestones, his staff, his broad-brimmed hat, the scallop shell on his cloak, all symbols of the soul's readiness to journey wherever God called. To the weary, he was strength, to the sinner, mercy, to the proud, humility. His life, marked by thunder and tempered by grace, reflected the same transformation each pilgrim longed to live. But as the centuries turned, the world around the shrine changed. Kingdoms fought over the lands through which pilgrims passed, and the roads that once echoed with songs of faith were darkened by the shadows of war. Yet even in those times of strife, the pilgrimage endured. It was as if the saint himself guarded it with invisible hands. When the fires of the Inquisition burned across Europe and doubt began to gnaw at faith, the road remained a refuge, a place where the noise of the world gave way to the stillness of prayer. For those who had lost their way in life, the path to Santiago became a return to themselves. Each step, each mile, peeled away the layers of pride, fear, and forgetfulness, revealing the simple truth at the heart of existence, that man was made to seek, and in seeking, to find. The story of St. James also found new meaning across the seas. When missionaries carried the gospel to the New World, they brought with them the devotion to Santiago, and his image became a symbol of endurance in lands far from Spain. Churches rose in his honor from Mexico to Chile, each one echoing the faith of those early pilgrims who once crossed the mountains of Europe. His feast day, celebrated on July 25th, became a moment of unity for believers across continents, a reminder that the love of Christ, once carried by fishermen across the Sea of Galilee, had reached the ends of the earth. In distant villages, his statue would be carried in procession through the streets, the air filled with hymns and incense, the people chanting his name with reverence. Wherever faith took root, St. James was there, not as a relic of the past, but as a living flame kindled in the hearts of the faithful. The modern world would come, bringing with it the rush of progress and the clamor of machines. But even then, the road to Santiago refused to die. When faith waned and the old certainties crumbled, the Camino endured like a silent sermon. Those who had ceased to pray still walked it, drawn by something they could not explain. Some came for beauty, some for solitude, some merely for the challenge. But along the way, the spirit of the apostle touched them all. The road worked upon them gently, as it always had. Under the open sky, the distinctions of wealth, age, and creed faded away. All became travelers together, bound by the same dust and the same hope. The rhythm of walking, the long silences, the kindness of strangers, all became sacraments of grace. By the time they reached the great cathedral, many found that what they sought had already been given, not an answer, but a peace that passes understanding. Within the vast cathedral of Santiago, where incense rises like mist and light filters through ancient glass, the story of St. James continues to unfold. Pilgrims stand before his silver casket, their faces illuminated by the flicker of candles, their hearts filled with quiet awe. Some weep, others simply stand in silence. All feel that strange nearness, the sense that the fisherman who once followed Jesus still stands among them. Above the high altar, the great statue of the apostle, dressed as a pilgrim, gazes outward over the sea of souls who have come to honor him. The weight of centuries seems to hang in the air, yet it is not a weight of sorrow, but of grace. For every soul who has walked that road, every tear shed, every prayer whispered into the wind, has become part of the great living tapestry of faith woven around his name. And yet beyond all the grandeur, beyond the processions and the music, the truest image of St. James remains that of the man himself, the young fisherman of Galilee who left his nets at a single word. In him, the Church remembers what it means to follow Christ, to love fiercely, to fail and rise again, to serve without fear. His was a faith born in fire, tested by suffering, and crowned in blood. It is a reminder that every Christian life, whether quiet or bold, is a pilgrimage through the mystery of God's love. The path is seldom straight. It winds through joy and sorrow, through moments of darkness and glimpses of glory. But to walk it with an open heart is to walk, as James did, in the footsteps of the Lord himself. As the night deepens over Compostela and the candles in the cathedral burn low, one might imagine that the saint still walks among the pilgrims who sleep along the roads, his staff tapping softly against the stones. Perhaps he whispers to them the same invitation he once heard beside the sea, to trust, to follow, to surrender. And perhaps, as they dream, they feel a peace that words cannot hold, the quiet assurance that the destination they seek is not only a place, but a presence. The road that leads to Santiago, like the journey of every soul, begins and ends in that presence. It begins with a call and ends with a meeting. Between the two lies the mystery of life itself, the long walk from the known into the unknown, from fear into love. Thus, the story of St. James the Greater becomes, in the end, a story not only of one man, but of all who walk in faith. His thunder has become the echo of countless hearts, his pilgrimage, the map of every believer's longing. From Galilee to Compostela, from the sword of Herod to the field of stars, his journey speaks of the same unchanging truth, that no power can silence the soul that loves God. For the man who once walked beside the sea now walks beyond time, guiding those who still dare to follow the voice that first called him by name. James, son of Zebedee, come and see. In the centuries that followed the golden age of pilgrimage, the devotion to St. James the Greater continued to breathe through the pulse of Christian life, though the world around it changed in ways the early apostles could never have imagined. The Middle Ages, with their mixture of faith and fear, wonder and war, had seen the Camino as the great artery of Christendom, a road where all could meet as equals under heaven. But as time passed and empires rose and fell, that unity began to fade. The Reformation divided Europe. The Enlightenment questioned what faith once took for granted. Yet even when the Church's influence waned in courts and universities, the memory of St. James endured in the hearts of the humble. He was not a figure of argument, but of experience, a man who had seen the divine with his own eyes, who had loved and suffered and remained faithful. That human truth could never be erased, for it belonged not to doctrine, but to the heart's memory. In Spain, where his relics rested beneath the vaulted stones of Santiago, devotion to the apostle remained a thread binding together generations. Each July, when his feast day returned, the bells would toll across the land, and processions would fill the streets. Farmers laid sheaves of wheat before his altars, sailors blessed their nets, and soldiers saluted his image before riding to war. His name had become interwoven with the identity of a people who saw in him both protector and brother. They called him Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moor Slayer, not in hatred of others but as a symbol of triumph over darkness, the victory of faith over fear. Yet beneath the martial legend lay a gentler truth, that James, who had once wished to call down fire upon his enemies, had himself been transformed by love. The sword in his hand, as painted by later centuries, was never meant for vengeance but for courage. The courage to defend the light when shadows grew long. Beyond Spain's borders, the Camino slowly fell into quietness. Wars and plagues, political turmoil and secular disillusionment emptied the once crowded roads. The great inns where monks had tended pilgrims turned to ruins, their stone arches crumbling under ivy. The sound of prayer gave way to silence, and for a time it seemed as though the road itself slept beneath the dust of neglect. Yet even in those years of forgetting, a few lonely travelers still walked the path. They came not as part of any grand movement, but as souls drawn by some whisper they could not ignore. The road had become, once again, what it was in the beginning: a personal encounter, a hidden conversation between God and one heart at a time. And in this quiet, the spirit of St. James waited, patient as ever, knowing that faith is not measured by numbers, but by endurance. Then, in the modern age, when the noise of progress filled the air and men thought they had outgrown the need for saints, something unexpected began to happen. The old roads came alive again. From the mountains of the Pyrenees to the wind-swept plains of Castile, the sound of footsteps returned. They were not only the faithful, but the searching, the lost, the broken, the curious, and the hopeful. Some came carrying questions that no philosophy could answer. Others came because they had lost everything and needed to begin again. And along the way, as in the days of old, something unseen worked upon them. They walked through rain and heat, through silence and solitude, and in the rhythm of their steps, they found healing. The Camino became a bridge between the sacred and the secular, a road where belief and doubt could walk side by side. In the villages along the route, the locals once again opened their doors. Old traditions reawakened. Bread offered freely, blessings spoken in many tongues, candles burning in small chapels beside the road. Pilgrims from every corner of the world met one another with smiles that needed no translation. At night, under the vast Spanish sky, they shared their stories, their fears, their regrets, their reasons for walking. Some spoke of grief that had long shadowed their hearts, others of joy rediscovered after years of silence. And in those shared moments, St. James seemed near once more, his presence not as thunder, but as a soft wind passing through the olive trees. The same man who had once followed Christ by the Sea of Galilee now walked among the modern seekers who still followed the same voice, though they heard it in many different ways. The pilgrimage had become, once again, what it was always meant to be. Not an escape from life, but a journey into its heart. Along the Camino, the pilgrims rediscovered the sacredness of small things, the warmth of bread, the coolness of water, the kindness of a stranger's greeting. The road itself became a kind of living gospel, teaching through simplicity what books could no longer convey. In the end, those who reached Santiago rarely found the answers they expected. Instead, they found peace, quiet, deep, and without explanation. Standing before the cathedral's great facade, worn smooth by centuries of prayer, they felt themselves part of something timeless. They knelt before the silver reliquary that held the remains of the apostle and realized that faith, at its purest, was not about certainty, but about presence, the presence of love that endures through every generation. Inside the cathedral, where golden light spills from the high windows and the great censer swings like a pendulum of incense and flame, the pilgrim's heart understands something words cannot hold. Here the story of St. James, so ancient and yet so alive, finds its fullest meaning. His bones rest in silence, but his spirit moves through the crowd like a current of grace. The thunder of his youth has become the heartbeat of every prayer rising in that sacred space. The sound of the organ fills the air, echoing through the arches like waves upon a distant shore, and one can almost imagine the apostle standing once again beside the Sea of Galilee, hearing the Master's call carried on the wind. And perhaps that is what keeps the story of St. James alive after 2,000 years. Not the miracles or the legends, but the memory of that call. For every generation must hear it anew, the invitation to leave behind what is safe and follow where love leads. It is a call that asks for trust, for courage, for surrender. James heard it beside the water. Countless others have heard it on the road to Santiago, and still others hear it in the quiet places of their own hearts. The world changes, the roads crumble, but the call remains the same. As dusk falls over the spires of Compostela, the city glows like an ember beneath the stars. Pilgrims sit upon the cathedral steps, watching the sky darken, their walking sticks resting beside them. Some will go home tomorrow, others will continue to the sea at Finisterre, the end of the known world. But all of them, whether they know it or not, carry something of the apostle within them, a fragment of his faith, a spark of his courage, a whisper of his peace. The journey does not end here. It begins anew in every heart that has walked this far. The story of St. James the Greater is not merely the tale of a man who died for Christ. It is the story of every soul that dares to live for him. It reminds us that holiness is not reserved for the few, but offered to all who are willing to be transformed. From the shores of Galilee to the fields of Compostela, his life forms a bridge between the first century and our own, between the thunder of zeal and the quiet of surrender. And in the end, perhaps that is the truest miracle of all, that a fisherman from a forgotten corner of the world could still, after so many centuries, teach us how to walk, how to love, and how to follow the voice that calls us home. As the Pilgrim's Road carried countless souls onward through centuries of dust, war, and renewal, the story of St. James continued to weave itself into the living breath of humanity. Time had stripped away the outward trappings of his age, but the pulse of his journey remained, the same rhythm that began with a call beside the Galilean Sea, that deepened in suffering under Herod's sword, and that found eternal peace upon the quiet shores of Spain. The name Santiago became not just a word upon lips or banners, but a thread running through the inner history of faith itself. Those who followed his path did so not only with feet, but with hearts. They sought, as James once sought, to understand the mystery of love that triumphs over death. And in each generation, his presence took on new meaning. For the saint who had once walked in sandals and carried nets had become, in the truest sense, a traveler beyond time, one who met the seeker wherever the soul dared to wander. The city of Santiago de Compostela grew around his tomb, swelling into a place where heaven and earth seemed to brush lightly against each other. Bells tolled each morning like the voice of the sea calling pilgrims home. Within its winding streets, the scent of bread and incense mingled, and beneath the shadow of the great cathedral, silence and song coexisted like two parts of a prayer. Artists carved his likeness upon stone, poets wrote of his road as a path of redemption, and preachers spoke of his courage as the purest flame of faith. Yet amid all this splendor, the truest tribute to St. James came not from words, but from footsteps, the steady, countless steps of those who walked, carrying grief or gratitude, penance or praise. For each soul that reached his shrine was, in some hidden way, continuing the apostle's own unfinished mission, to bring the world closer to the living Christ. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the cathedral's doors were still closed and the square lay empty beneath the stars, one could almost sense the stillness that surrounded his relics below the altar. There, beneath layers of marble and centuries, rested the bones of a man who had once known the sound of the Master's voice, who had touched his garments and seen his glory upon the mountain. The pilgrims who came to kneel above that place often wept, not from sorrow, but from the strange, unexplainable recognition that they too were part of the same story. It was as though the walls themselves whispered of the years when faith was young, when men and women gave their lives not for reward, but for love. In that dim silence, all distance between ages seemed to vanish. The fisherman of Galilee was not a legend. He was a brother, still alive in the communion of saints, still interceding for those who struggled to believe, still walking beside them as they carried their own small crosses along the winding road of life. Outside, the city's life moved on. Markets opened, Laughter echoed through the arcades, and the world went about its restless turning. Yet beneath it all, the invisible river of pilgrimage never ceased to flow. Each day new faces arrived from distant lands, students, monks, widows, laborers, seekers of truth. Some walked barefoot in penance, others leaned upon sticks carved with scallop shells, symbols of the sea and of journey's end. They spoke many languages, yet shared the same prayer: to find meaning, to touch the sacred, to be renewed. And though some would leave unchanged, others felt a quiet transformation take hold of them, subtle but enduring. For the way of St. James, like the gospel itself, worked not through thunder or spectacle, but through silence and perseverance. Its miracles were those of the heart: conversion, reconciliation, the courage to forgive and to begin again. The modern pilgrim, like his ancient forebear, discovered that to walk toward Santiago was to walk inward. Each mile peeled away the distractions of daily life until only the essentials remained: breath, light, and trust. Along the path, the landscape itself seemed to preach: fields of golden wheat swaying under the wind, lonely chapels standing sentinel upon the hills, rivers murmuring their eternal hymns. Nature became a living psalm, and the soul, stripped of its noise, could finally listen. Many who began the journey as tourists ended it as believers. They found, as James had found long ago, that God often speaks most clearly not in comfort, but in fatigue, not in clarity, but in mystery. The road, with its hardships and its beauty, became a mirror of the gospel, the narrow way that leads to life. Within the rhythm of the pilgrimage lay another truth, one as old as the Church itself, that sanctity is never solitary. The pilgrims walked together, carrying one another's burdens, sharing water, food, and prayer. The friendships formed upon that dusty path often endured for years after the journey's end. They reflected the same communion that had once bound the apostles, a fellowship not of power or status, but of shared faith. And perhaps this, above all else, was the gift that St. James had left to the world: the reminder that discipleship is a shared road, that heaven is not reached alone. As one pilgrim wrote in his journal centuries ago, "The road to Santiago is long, but the heart grows larger with every step." When the pilgrims at last reached the cathedral and heard the mighty Botafumeiro swing through the air, trailing clouds of incense that filled the nave like smoke from the altars of heaven, they felt the culmination of something far greater than travel. The scent, the light, the solemn music, all drew their hearts toward that one enduring truth: that life itself is a pilgrimage, beginning in birth and ending not in death but in return. As the censor's arc traced its slow, majestic path from one end of the cathedral to the other, the watchers below felt themselves caught in its motion, as if their own spirits were being lifted heavenward with the fragrant smoke. In that moment, St. James was no longer a distant figure of marble or silver. He was present, alive in every breath of incense, every whispered prayer, every tear of gratitude shed by those who finally understood that the end of the road is not a place, but a presence. And when the pilgrims departed, taking with them the shell that marked them as children of the way, they did not leave the apostle behind. His blessing traveled with them, invisible but enduring. Many returned to lives of ordinary labor, yet found that the memory of the road changed how they lived. They spoke more gently, forgave more quickly, prayed more simply. The seed of transformation, once planted, bore quiet fruit, and in each act of kindness, each renewed prayer, the spirit of St. James lived on. Thus the story continued, as it always will, for the saint's mission is not bound to time. Every generation must learn anew what it means to follow Christ with the courage of James, to listen when the voice calls, to walk when the path is hard, and to trust that love will lead them home. For though centuries pass and kingdoms fall, the call remains the same, echoing across the winds of history like the murmur of the sea. Follow me, and those who answer, whether by the shores of Galilee or along the pilgrim road to Compostela, find that the journey of the apostle is also their own, the eternal journey of the soul from earth to heaven, from storm to peace, from beginning to endless light. The centuries that followed saw the spirit of St. James continue to shape not only the faithful who walked to Compostela, but also the imagination and culture of the Christian world. His story had crossed from history into eternity, from the dusty pages of chronicles into the living rhythm of faith itself. In the heart of Spain, his name remained the sound of hope. In the rest of Europe, his image became the sign of journey, of perseverance, of trust in the divine will. Yet, as faith ebbed and flowed through the ages, the essence of his message did not change. It was still the same invitation that had echoed over the waters of Galilee, to leave behind what binds the soul and to follow the whisper of the eternal call. Though the form of devotion transformed, the pilgrim spirit that had animated the first disciples continued to move, quiet yet unbroken, through the lives of those who longed for more than the world could give. In the Renaissance, as art and reason blossomed, St. James was depicted not only as the heavenly protector of Spain, but also as a symbol of the harmony between faith and human effort. Artists painted him with the grace of a hero and the humility of a servant, blending strength and peace into one timeless figure. Sculptors carved him at the entrances of cathedrals, greeting travelers with a calm, knowing gaze, as if to remind each visitor that the truest beauty is found not in marble, but in mercy. His story, once told in simple songs by the fireside, was now illuminated in manuscripts, engraved in gold, and painted upon the walls of monasteries, where silence spoke louder than speech. The Camino itself, though still a path of devotion, became a symbol of Europe's shared soul, a road of reconciliation where cultures met and faith transcended borders. In those same centuries, sailors departing for the New World carried the name of Santiago on their lips. The star that guided them across the Atlantic was, to them, the same light that had shone above Compostela. Wherever the cross was planted, the pilgrim's shell followed. From the Caribbean to the Andes, chapels rose under his protection, and his feast day was celebrated with processions of music and color, blending old faith with new land. The image of St. James as protector of travelers and seafarers found new meaning among those who braved oceans instead of roads, who sought not the tomb in Galicia, but the kingdom of God in distant lands. His spirit, once carried across a small sea in a boat without oars, now crossed the great waters of the world, still guided by the same invisible hand. Even as the modern age began to cast off its old certainties, and the march of science seemed to leave little room for miracles, the memory of St. James endured. The rational mind could not easily explain why the roads to Compostela continued to call so many. Yet year after year, pilgrims still set out, drawn by something ancient and eternal. They were not all believers, at least not in the beginning. Some came to heal from grief, others to escape the weight of the world, still others out of curiosity, or the faint hope that walking might mend the broken edges of their souls. But as they passed through the mountains, through the sunlit plains and quiet valleys, something in the air seemed to change them. They began to walk not toward Santiago, but toward themselves, toward the mystery that lives in every human heart. Along the way, the figure of the apostle became a silent teacher once more. He did not speak in visions or apparitions, but in the simple lessons of fatigue and persistence, in the generosity of strangers and the beauty of morning light after rain. Each footstep became a prayer, each hardship a confession, each small joy a taste of grace. When they reached the cathedral, many found that they no longer needed answers. They needed only to kneel. The faith of St. James had entered them quietly, as the tide enters the shore, reshaping the landscape of their hearts without noise or demand. In the long stillness before his relics, they found not the end of their journey but its true beginning. The discovery that God had walked with them all along, even in their silence, even in their doubt. Within the walls of the cathedral, beneath its arches carved by centuries of devotion, the echo of history and the pulse of eternity met. There, pilgrims saw themselves as part of something vast yet intimate, the communion of saints that binds all believers beyond time. For James, who had walked beside Christ and drunk his cup, was not gone. His life was a bridge between the early church and all who came after. His witness whispered the same truth to every age, that faith is not an idea but a path, not a possession but a journey. It cannot be carried in the mind alone. It must be lived step by step, through joy and through suffering, until it becomes love. Outside, the world continued to change. The machines of progress grew louder, and the quiet of contemplation became rare. Yet the Camino remained, like a thread of stillness woven through the noise of modern life. Men and women who had lost their way in the cities of light found themselves walking again beneath the same sky that had watched the apostles 2,000 years before. They walked not out of duty, but out of longing, a longing for meaning, for simplicity, for a presence that could not be bought or measured. And though they might not have named it at first, what they were seeking was the same presence that had transformed a fisherman into a saint, the living Christ. At night, when the sky over Spain burned with countless stars, the pilgrims often lay awake and wondered what it must have been like to stand beside Jesus, to see his face, to hear his voice, and in those moments of yearning, they found themselves close to James. For the saint was no distant figure of stone, but a companion on the road of faith, one who had known the same fire of zeal, the same failures, the same fears, and who had found, through all of them, the peace that comes only from surrender. His life, so human and yet so divine in its transformation, reminded them that sanctity is not a sudden miracle, but a long obedience. When the dawn came, gilding the spires of Compostela in gold, the pilgrims would rise again to continue their journey inward, carrying the memory of the apostle like a flame sheltered against the wind. The story of St. James was still being written in their lives, in every act of kindness, in every prayer whispered under breath, in every heart turned again toward God. And so it is that his road remains alive even now, a river of grace running through the centuries, fed by the tears, the faith, and the footsteps of all who dare to believe that love is worth the walking. For in the end, the story of St. James is not merely a chapter of Christian history. It is a mirror of the soul's destiny. His life began in thunder and ended in peace, but both were the same sound, the voice of God calling him onward. Every believer, whether they ever walk the Camino or not, carries that same invitation within them. The way of St. James is the way of the gospel itself, a path from self to surrender, from striving to trust, from earth to eternity. And just as the waves of the Galilean Sea once whispered his name, so too the wind over Compostela seems still to murmur it, softly, endlessly, as though time itself is praying. Santiago, the friend of God, lead us on. The centuries continued to flow as rivers of time, washing over empires, faiths, and men. Yet the story of St. James the Greater refused to fade. It lived not in books alone, but in hearts, in footsteps, in whispered prayers beneath the stars. His road, worn by millions of souls, remained like an artery of light through the body of Christendom. Every stone along the Camino carried memory, every chapel told of longing, and every weary traveler echoed that same act of trust that had once transformed a fisherman into an apostle. In this way, the legend of James became more than history. It became the rhythm of redemption itself, quietly reminding the world that holiness is found not at journey's end, but in the journey's endurance. As the modern world moved further from the simplicity of faith, the pilgrimage paradoxically grew stronger. The age of disbelief could not silence the call that rises from within the human spirit, the yearning for meaning, for reconciliation, for the peace that surpasses knowledge. Pilgrims once again filled the ancient roads, though now they came from every corner of the earth. Some were believers returning to their roots, others were seekers of silence, still others had no name for what they sought at all. Yet as they walked, through mist-covered valleys, across barren plateaus, beneath the endless sky, they found that the world's noise began to fall away. The sound of footsteps replaced it. A steady rhythm like prayer beads dropped one by one along the road. Somewhere between exhaustion and wonder, the voice of God seemed to return, soft yet unmistakable, reminding each traveler that grace does not belong to the perfect, but to the willing. In every century, there are those who rediscover St. James, not as a relic of the past, but as a living presence, a companion for the pilgrim soul. In the quiet hours of walking, when loneliness weighs heavy and the mind turns inward, his story feels close. The fiery disciple who learned patience, the man of passion who was taught by Christ to love unto death. His life becomes a mirror to every believer's struggle between zeal and surrender. When a pilgrim prays beside the simple cross of wood planted on a hill, they are, in some hidden way, praying beside James again. The dust of the Camino mingles with the dust of Galilee, and time collapses into eternity. For many, the journey does not end even when they reach the Cathedral of Santiago. They kneel before his relics and feel not arrival, but beginning. The statue of the apostle above the altar, robed as a pilgrim himself, gazes downward with the calm of one who has seen both glory and suffering. Beneath his silver shell, the air is filled with incense and the sound of ancient hymns. Yet beyond the solemn beauty, there is simplicity, the same simplicity that marked his first calling by the lake. Follow me. Those words, unchanged across ages, remain the true destination of every soul. The pilgrims rise again, carrying the peace they have found like a hidden treasure, returning home as different people, their eyes quieter, their hearts larger. It is said that even now, miracles occur along the way, not the grand, sudden kind that defy nature, but the quiet transformations that turn despair into hope, anger into forgiveness. A stranger's kindness, a sunrise after a storm, a prayer spoken without words, all become signs of grace. St. James's presence lingers in these moments like light upon water, unseen but real. Those who walk the road learn, as he once did, that God's power is not always in the thunder, but often in the still, small voice. And so the road remains holy ground, trodden by countless lives seeking the same invisible shore. In recent years, as pilgrims from across faiths and philosophies have rediscovered the Camino, the story of St. James has found new meaning for a new world. For some, he stands as the guardian of faith's endurance in an age of forgetting. For others, he embodies the universal longing for truth that transcends creeds. To walk his path is to rediscover the sacredness of the human spirit, to remember that to live is to journey, and to journey is to open the heart to what cannot be seen. Along that road, the pilgrim learns the same lesson that James learned before his martyrdom, that love and suffering are not opposites but companions, that faith grows not in triumph but in trust. At dusk, when the great censer swings in the cathedral, scattering clouds of sweet smoke through the nave, one can almost hear the echo of the sea, the same sea that once carried the apostle's body to Spain. The sound of the choir rises, ancient and gentle, singing of resurrection, of hope beyond sorrow. And among the crowd, some weep silently, not because they have reached the end, but because they have at last understood what the end truly is, the meeting of love with its source. Above them, the figure of St. James gleams in candlelight, his staff raised as if in blessing. He does not speak, yet every pilgrim knows what he would say, that the same Christ who called him still calls each of us to rise and walk, not toward a place, but toward a presence. Outside, the wind sweeps through the square, carrying the scent of rain and stone. The stars, which gave Compostela its name, flicker like watchful eyes. Pilgrims sit quietly, some in conversation, some in thought, their boots dusty, their faces glowing with fatigue and peace. They have walked together yet alone, and in that solitude shared, they have found communion. The spirit of St. James moves among them still, not as a warrior or a conqueror, but as a brother of the road. His legacy endures in their tired laughter, in their simple gratitude, in the silence that now fills what words cannot. And so the story comes full circle. From the shores of Galilee to the fields of Spain, from a fisherman's net to the pilgrim's staff, the life of James remains a testament to the mystery of vocation. It is not greatness that God calls, but willingness. The man who once asked for honor beside Christ's throne became the first to give his life for him, and in that surrender he found the glory he had sought, not glory of fame, but of love fulfilled. His blood, shed in Jerusalem, seeded a faith that would reach the ends of the earth. His bones, resting beneath Compostela's stars, became a sign that the journey of faith has no end. Now, whenever a soul dares to follow that ancient whisper, whenever someone chooses forgiveness over bitterness, hope over despair, surrender over pride, the road of St. James opens anew. It may not be paved with stones or marked by shells, yet it is the same path, leading always toward light. And when that final step is taken, when the pilgrim's journey through life meets its own sunset, perhaps beyond the veil of time, St. James will be there as he has always been, smiling with that same calm strength, extending a hand as he once did to the Master, and saying, "Here, Lord, another traveler has come home." The quiet centuries that followed did not erase the glow of Santiago's light, but rather deepened it. Time, with all its weight of wars and empires, revolutions and reforms, could not silence the enduring truth that had taken root there. Beneath the vaults of the cathedral, candles continued to burn, and pilgrims continued to arrive. Some came in rags, others cloaked in finery, but all were humbled beneath the same arches, all knelt before the same mystery. The story of St. James had become more than the story of a man. It was the story of every believer's heart, a rhythm of calling and response, of exile and return. Even when the world grew cynical, when the noise of machines drowned out the whispers of the Spirit, the road remained, patient as eternity itself, The soul of the Camino had become the soul of humanity's unending longing for God. In the early centuries of the modern age, men of letters and travelers of science began to rediscover the ancient road, not as an act of devotion, but as a thread through history. Yet even they could not walk its length without being changed. The ruins of monasteries and the broken stones of forgotten bridges spoke to them in a language older than their disbelief. They sensed that the dust upon those roads was sacred, pressed by countless feet moved by faith. And some, who had set out with curiosity alone, found that something within them softened with each passing mile. For it is the quiet persistence of holy things that undoes the arrogance of certainty. The same voice that called James from his nets still spoke through wind and shadow, whispering across the centuries that truth never vanishes. It only waits to be remembered. Within the Church, devotion to St. James continued to evolve. His image was carried into the New World by missionaries and settlers, woven into the faith of new nations. In the Philippines, in Mexico, in Peru, the Feast of Santiago became a feast of color and thanksgiving, where music and dance mingled with prayer. Beneath the exuberance, though, remained a deep reverence, a recognition that this apostle of fire and thunder had once laid down his life in silence and obedience. His story, crossing oceans and languages, became a bridge between peoples, a reminder that holiness knows no frontier. Where others saw conquest, the faithful saw continuity, the passing of a light from one shore to another, burning steadily in the hands of those who dared to follow. And still, in Spain, the cathedral remained the heart of the world's pilgrimage. Each July, the Feast of St. James transformed the quiet city into a living hymn. The bells rang from dawn until deep into the night, their echoes rippling over the hills. Pilgrims poured in from every direction, some limping, some singing, some in tears. The great censer swung through the air, scattering clouds of smoke that rose like prayers. And amid that sea of faces, one could always find the same expressions of wonder, relief, and gratitude. Some pilgrims embraced, others stood silent before the altar, unable to speak. Yet all shared a single truth, that every step of their journey, every hardship endured, had led them to this moment of stillness before the relics of the saint. It was in this sacred silence that the mystery of St. James's life reached its fullness. His story had begun with a call and ended with surrender, but in truth, it had never ended at all. The martyrdom that had seemed a tragedy became, through faith, a seed that flowered across the earth. The thunder of his spirit did not die beneath Herod's blade. It resounded still, not in fury, but in love. The fire that once sought to destroy had become the light that guided. The Son of Thunder had become the apostle of peace, and every pilgrim who came to kneel at his tomb carried home a spark of that same light. Over the centuries, many who walked the road wrote of what they found along the way. Some spoke of visions or miracles, others of inner healing so quiet it could scarcely be named. One told of a night spent alone under the stars, when he suddenly understood that his life, with all its wandering, had been a kind of pilgrimage all along. Another wrote that at the cathedral's threshold he had felt not triumph, but humility, the recognition that even the longest road is short compared to eternity. These confessions, scattered through time, form a chorus of souls echoing the same discovery, that the road of St. James leads not to a shrine, but to a conversion of the heart. As the 20th century unfolded with all its turmoil, wars that scarred continents, ideologies that promised paradise but delivered despair, the pilgrimage endured as a quiet rebellion. In a world that hurried, it invited slowness. In a world that shouted, it offered silence. Those who had lost faith in nations or leaders began to find solace in the ancient rhythm of the Camino. There, no one asked what one believed, only where one had come from and whether one needed bread. The simplicity of that exchange became a form of grace. Strangers shared water and stories, laughter and pain, and in that sharing rediscovered what the modern age had almost forgotten, that the heart of faith is communion. And so the legend of St. James entered the modern heart, not as dogma, but as living truth. Artists began to paint him again, not as a warrior, but as a pilgrim with dust on his feet and light in his eyes. Writers found in his story a metaphor for the human search for meaning. Even those who did not kneel still felt the power of the journey that bore his name. It was as if the saint himself had chosen to speak once more, not in words, but in the quiet witness of the road, the witness that love is patient, that grace is slow, that redemption waits along the way for all who will walk it. And as night falls over Compostela today, when the last pilgrim's steps fade from the square and the cathedral doors close, a deep peace settles over the city. Somewhere within its ancient walls, a single candle burns beside the apostle's tomb, its flame trembling softly in the dark. Outside, the stars shine over the field that gave the city its name, the Campus Stellae. In that stillness, one can almost feel the presence of St. James himself, watching over the countless souls who have come and gone, whispering the same eternal blessing that has outlasted kingdoms and centuries. Walk in faith. The road is long, but it leads home. Hamduifatsum. For though the world will continue to change, though faith will take new forms and languages, the essence of his story will never die. It is written not in stone or scripture alone, but in the living hearts of those who walk toward light. Each generation will find him anew, the fiery disciple, the steadfast witness, the pilgrim who followed Christ to the end. And each will hear, beneath the noise of life, that same tender voice that once sounded above the waters of Galilee and still speaks across the ages. Follow me, and I will make you a fisher of souls. There are moments in the long history of faith when the veil between the seen and the unseen seems to grow thin, when the living feel the presence of those who have gone before them, as though they were only a few steps ahead on the road. The story of St. James belongs to such a moment, a bridge between heaven and earth that has never truly closed. As centuries gathered and faded, his influence deepened not only in the faith of the Church, but in the imagination of humanity itself. His image, carved in stone above countless doors and altars, became a symbol of protection and passage, a companion for every traveler who dared to set out into uncertainty. He was the saint of those in motion, the friend of those who left home behind. His was the blessing whispered over ships as they left the harbor, over pilgrims as they took their first step, over souls as they prepared to depart this life for the next. In the Middle Ages, when Europe was a tapestry of small kingdoms and fragile hopes, St. James stood as both anchor and horizon. The pilgrim roads to Compostela served not only as routes of devotion, but as arteries of connection. They carried not just prayers, but languages, art, and knowledge. The inns that rose along the way became schools of compassion, where strangers learned to share, to listen, and to forgive. The Church, in her wisdom, saw that pilgrimage was not simply a journey toward a relic, but a movement of grace through time. Each pilgrim who returned home brought with him a little of the saint's courage, a little of his fire, and in this way the faith of James spread far beyond the walls of the cathedral that held his bones. It was said that those who walked the road could never again see the world in the same way. The mountains, once feared for their solitude, became cathedrals of stone. The rivers, once barriers, became reflections of heaven. A man might begin the Camino with bitterness in his heart, and find that somewhere between sunrise and sunset, he had learned how to forgive. A woman might begin in grief, and find, before the journey's end, that she had been gently taught how to hope again. Such were the miracles of St. James, quiet, unrecorded, yet countless as the stars over Compostela. For the road he blessed did not promise escape from pain, but transformation through it. Even in times of spiritual dryness, when the faith of nations grew weary, the flame of Santiago continued to burn. The wars of the world raged, but the pilgrim's road endured. Empires fell, but the shell of the pilgrim remained a sign of peace. In the age of conquest, when men sailed under flags of empire, the name of Santiago crossed oceans, carved upon ships that carried both faith and fear. His image stood in cathedrals from Manila to Lima, his name woven into the prayers of people who had never seen Spain. The road that had once run from France to Galicia now extended across seas and continents. And though the world often misunderstood the faith it carried, the essence of St. James's mission remained, the witness that Christ's call knows no frontier. As the world entered the modern age, the road seemed to fall silent for a time. The machines of progress roared, the old languages of faith grew faint, and many began to walk other paths in search of meaning. Yet even then, the silence was not empty. Beneath the surface of disbelief, the ancient longing remained. When the century turned again, when humanity found itself restless and weary amid its abundance, the Camino awoke. Thousands, then tens of thousands, returned to its ancient stones, drawn by a call they could not name. They came carrying backpacks and questions, memories and grief, but what they carried home was always lighter than what they had brought. It is not unusual now to see the roads to Compostela filled once more with pilgrims, some young, some old, some of faith, others simply of wonder. They come from every corner of the earth, walking together under the same sky, learning to share water, bread, and silence. The old rhythm returns, the morning bell, the dust of the path, the greeting of peace exchanged between strangers. And at the heart of this modern pilgrimage, the spirit of St. James is alive again, not as a relic of superstition, but as a living teacher of simplicity, endurance, and grace. His story has become a universal language. He reminds the world, so often fractured by speed and pride, that holiness begins not in perfection, but in walking humbly toward what is good. Those who reach the cathedral now stand before his silver casket as their ancestors once did. They rest their hands upon the stone, whisper prayers for loved ones, or simply weep in silence. The same music still fills the air, the same incense curls upward, the same bells toll across the city. Yet within every pilgrim, the story is new again. Each one brings his own Galilee, his own Herod, his own moment of calling. And somehow, in the presence of the apostle, they find peace. The journey of James becomes their own, the passage from fear to trust, from self to surrender. In this meeting of stories, the communion of saints becomes not a doctrine, but a living truth. For those who cannot travel, the road still exists within the soul. Every act of faith, every step toward forgiveness, every prayer spoken in darkness is a pilgrimage. To love when love seems impossible is to walk the Camino. To forgive what wounds you is to walk it again. St. James's message has always been this, that every human life is a journey from earth to heaven, and that Christ walks with us even when the path is rough and unseen. The shells worn by pilgrims upon their cloaks are symbols of that truth, the lines of the shell all meeting at the same point, as all paths of love lead back to God. And so, when night falls over Santiago and the last pilgrim lights a candle before the altar, the story continues. The glow of that small flame joins 1,000 others that have burned there through the centuries, each one a soul who found, at journey's end, that faith was never a destination, but a companionship. Somewhere, the spirit of the apostle still moves among them, unseen yet near, whispering the words he learned from his master on that first day beside the sea. Do not be afraid. For the pilgrim road is not only the path to Compostela, it is the road of life itself, winding, uncertain, and blessed. And at its end, as at its beginning, there waits the same voice that once turned a fisherman into a saint, the voice of eternal love, calling each of us home. As the centuries fold into the pages of memory, the story of St. James the Greater stands as one of the most enduring testaments to the mystery of faith. A story at once simple and profound, rooted in time, yet eternally alive. The fisherman who once mended nets by the Sea of Galilee became, through the power of grace, a lighthouse to generations. His path from zeal to peace, from thunder to silence, mirrors the transformation every soul is called to live. Even now, in the world's restless turning, his presence endures like the low hum of the tide beneath the noise of the wind. The roads to Santiago are still walked, the cathedral still glows like a beacon under the stars, and his name, Santiago, Sanctus Jacobus, St. James, still carries the sound of homecoming. For in every age, the story of this apostle speaks to a deeper truth, that the call of Christ, once heard, never fades, and that no distance, neither death nor centuries, can silence the echo of a yes once given in love. The world of today, shaped by both wonder and weariness, continues to seek what St. James found. Men and women travel faster now than ever before, yet many find themselves more lost than those who walked barefoot across Europe in search of a shrine. The modern pilgrim's heart is not so different from the heart of that fisherman so long ago. Restless, desiring, hungry for meaning. The Camino, with its winding trails and humble shelters, offers a counterpoint to a world obsessed with speed. It slows the heartbeat of humanity back to its natural rhythm. The act of walking, once ordinary, becomes sacred again. Every sunrise, every step becomes prayer. Those who walk the road today are not so much escaping the world as returning to its center, rediscovering that life is not about arrival, but about presence. The quiet attentiveness to what lies before us, the grace of being exactly where one's feet are. St. James teaches this lesson still, that holiness does not lie in great acts alone, but in fidelity to the call that asks everything and gives back peace. His fiery youth reminds us that God does not reject our passion, but purifies it, that zeal, when rooted in love, becomes strength. His martyrdom reminds us that no suffering freely embraced for truth is ever wasted. In his life we see that discipleship is not a matter of control, but of surrender, not triumph, but transformation. The Son of Thunder became, through grace, a servant of peace, and that is the arc of every saint and every believer who learns to let God lead. In the hearts of those who revere him, St. James remains the apostle of courage. He reminds the Church that faith is not a refuge from the world's turmoil, but the strength to face it. Through him, we remember that the kingdom of God is built not on conquest or comfort, but on compassion. He was the first of the 12 to die for Christ, yet in that death, he gave birth to a legacy of life. The Church has never forgotten the power of that witness. Each time she reads the words, "You shall indeed drink of my cup," She sees reflected in James the courage of all martyrs who would come after him, men and women who, in their own age, took up that same cup with trembling hands and found in it not despair, but glory. His name, so deeply tied to the soil of Spain, also became a symbol for the unity of the Church beyond borders. The Camino was not merely a path of piety, but a network of souls, a meeting place for peoples, a living expression of the universality of faith. In a world fractured by nations and differences, that road reminded humanity that all are travelers, all are children of the same God. To this day, when pilgrims from dozens of countries greet one another with Buen Camino, they echo a truth older than the stones beneath their feet, that grace makes strangers into companions. There is a quiet beauty in knowing that the relics of St. James rest in the far west of the world, where the land meets the sea and the sun sets in a blaze of gold. For the ancients, that horizon was the end of the earth. For the faithful, it became a sign of eternity. It is fitting that the man who first witnessed the glory of Christ's transfiguration should rest at the world's edge, where the sun seems to die only to rise again. His tomb is not a monument to death, but a promise of resurrection. The pilgrims who reach that place, weary and weathered, feel something of that same transfiguration, a dying of the old self, a dawning of new life. The ocean beyond Compostela is vast and unknowable, yet it mirrors the sea of grace into which James has led so many. As twilight gathers each evening, the bells of the cathedral toll across the city, their sound mingling with the songs of the faithful. Some linger in the square, watching the last light fade, while others slip quietly into the nave to kneel before the altar. The candlelight flickers upon the silver reliquary, and one can almost imagine the apostle standing there still, staff in hand, the dust of the road upon his cloak, his eyes lifted not in triumph, but in peace. In that peace lies the secret of his life, the serenity that comes only when one's will and God's will are no longer two, but one. Through every century, through every change of empire and language, the same mystery endures. The Word made flesh once looked upon this man and said, "Follow me." That gaze, that voice, created a saint. It continues to create saints today. For every person who leaves behind the comfort of certainty to walk in trust. For every soul who says yes to love, though it costs everything. For every believer who forgives, serves, and suffers with hope. There lives the spirit of St. James. The Church calls him an apostle, but heaven must surely call him something greater, a friend of God and a friend of all who seek him. The story of St. James is not only written in Scripture or carved in stone, it is written in the countless acts of courage, humility, and faith inspired by his name. It is found in the nurse who tends the dying with patience, in the priest who offers Mass in a forgotten village, in the traveler who carries the burdens of others without complaint. Each of them walks, knowingly or not, the same path of surrender that James walked. His road, like all true roads of faith, runs through the heart of humanity. And so the centuries will continue, and still the bells of Compostela will ring. Pilgrims will come and go, faith will wane and rise again, and the world will change beyond recognition. Yet this truth will endure, that once upon a time, a man heard the voice of Christ by the waters of Galilee, and followed him without looking back. From that simple act of trust came a river of grace that has never ceased to flow. It flows still, through the roads of Spain, through the prayers of the faithful, through the secret longing of every heart that yearns for God. The thunder of his youth has long since faded into the stillness of eternity. Yet if one listens closely enough, one might still hear it, carried on the wind across the pilgrim fields, the sound of faith awakening, of love calling the soul home. And so it comes to the final bend in the long road, where the story of St. James the Greater reaches not an end, but a kind of eternal pause, like the hush between two waves, or the silence that follows a prayer whispered in the dark. The fisherman who once left his nets on the shores of Galilee to follow a voice he barely understood became, in the eyes of generations, more than a disciple. He became a path, an enduring way of walking with God through the wilderness of time. His footprints, though worn away by centuries, have never disappeared. They have multiplied, carried forward by all who dared to follow, all who believed that life itself is a pilgrimage toward light. His story, like the steady rhythm of the tide, continues to speak in every age, reminding the restless heart that faith is not a destination to reach, but a journey to live. The memory of St. James rests gently now upon the city that bears his name. Santiago de Compostela, the field of stars, still glows beneath the great Atlantic sky, its cathedral rising like a hymn in stone. Pilgrims still arrive beneath its arches, their feet blistered, their eyes bright with tears. Some arrive singing, others barely speak. Many come alone and leave with companions they did not know they needed. In their weariness and wonder, the spirit of the apostle moves among them like a warm wind from an unseen shore. They lay their burdens before his relics, the worries, the guilt, the longings they carried across the miles. And in that surrender, they find what James found at the end of his own journey: peace through obedience, freedom through faith, love through sacrifice. For this is what the road teaches all who walk it, that the true miracle is not found at the end, but in the heart remade along the way. The light that spills through the cathedral's windows falls softly upon the pilgrims kneeling in silence. Candles burn like stars scattered across the floor, their flames flickering with human breath. Above the altar stands the statue of the saint himself, dressed as a pilgrim, his gaze turned outward, his staff held lightly in one hand, as though ready to set out again. It is said that each night, when the church grows still and only the sound of the sea reaches the city from afar, the saint walks unseen among the aisles, blessing those who have come to him. Whether this be legend or grace, none can say. Yet the peace that fills that place feels too alive to be only air. The stones themselves seem to hold memory, whispering the footsteps of those who came before, the kings and beggars, the mothers and monks, the seekers and doubters. All found their reflection there. All became part of his story, as he became part of theirs. Far beyond Compostela, the name of St. James continues to echo wherever the gospel is spoken. His feast day remains a moment of renewal, a time when the church remembers not only his martyrdom, but the fire of his love. Priests read again the words that tell of his boldness. Artists paint him with the calm eyes of one who has seen heaven, and the faithful light candles for courage in their own trials. He has become, through the ages, a symbol of perseverance, the saint who teaches that the soul must not grow faint even when the night is long. He is a reminder that to follow Christ is to walk toward the cross. Yes, but also toward resurrection. In this final reflection, we might ask what his story truly gives to those who hear it now, in a world so far removed from the olive groves and dusty roads of his time. Perhaps it gives what it has always given: hope that sanctity is not unreachable, that grace still works upon human weakness, that faith is not for the perfect, but for the willing. James was no stranger to failure, to pride, to fear. He struggled to understand his master's way. Yet when the moment of truth came, he stood firm, He did not run, as once he might have. He accepted the cup he had been promised. His witness reveals that the love of God can transform even the fiercest temper into gentleness, even the loudest ambition into surrender. His life is proof that holiness begins not in strength, but in openness, in the willingness to be changed by love. Through him, the Church also remembers the dignity of suffering offered in faith. His beheading under Herod's command was meant to extinguish a voice, yet it became the seed of 1,000 voices more. His blood fell upon the soil of Jerusalem, and from it rose the courage of martyrs and the endurance of pilgrims. His death was swift, yet its meaning unfolds still, quietly, wherever believers face hardship with hope. For every soul that carries a hidden cross, every heart that bears injustice without hatred, St. James walks beside them. His peace, born of sacrifice, is a light for all who suffer in silence. And though his story is anchored in faith, it belongs, in some mysterious way, to the whole of humanity. The Camino de Santiago, once a narrow thread of Christian devotion, has become a great river of souls, drawing believers and unbelievers alike toward a place of stillness. The road teaches all who travel it that we are more alike than different, more in need of mercy than of answers. Along its winding paths, the divisions of the world lose their power, and what remains is the shared heartbeat of creation, the quiet longing to be at home. This, too, is the legacy of St. James, the power to bring unity through compassion, to remind the world that the sacred hides within the ordinary, and that the journey itself is prayer. And so the pilgrim's road never ends. It continues through fields and valleys, through cities and solitude, through every human life that dares to hope. The stars still mark the way, as they did when the first hermit saw their light fall upon the forgotten tomb. The same wind that once filled the sails of the small boat carrying his body still blows across the Atlantic, carrying prayers from continent to continent. Every whisper of devotion, every act of kindness done in his name, keeps alive the current of grace that began when he first dropped his nets to follow the voice of the Lord. It is fitting, perhaps, that his story closes not with a crown or a triumph, but with a road, a path that continues beyond sight, leading toward the infinite horizon of God. For the life of St. James was never meant to be contained in a single time or place. It was, and remains, a living pilgrimage, a journey through love, loss, courage, and redemption that ends only in the heart of God himself. Those who walk after him do not merely remember a saint, they continue his walk. And perhaps that is the truest meaning of his legacy, that faith, once begun, is never finished, that the footsteps of the righteous echo beyond death, and that the story of one soul's yes to God can guide 1,000 others home. So may it be for all who hear his story. May the example of St. James remind us to listen when the voice of Christ calls, to follow even when the road is uncertain, and to trust that the storms within us can be transformed into peace. And when our own pilgrimage draws to its close, when the path of life narrows into light and the world behind us fades, may we too see him waiting on the far shore, his staff in hand, his eyes gentle with recognition, whispering as he once did to those beside the sea, "Come, the journey is over. You are home.